Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Murphy Institute's event today. My name is Andrew Ridland, and I am a 2L here at St. Thomas, as well as a dual degree student with the Catholic Studies Master's Program and a second-year Murphy Scholar. So we just want to thank you first and foremost for joining us today for this presentation on abortion and women's empowerment. What does the data show? The structure for today's presentation will consist of roughly 35 to 40 minutes of hearing from Professor Collett, followed by a time for Q&A. Now, in the past, we haven't done this. We're going to try out a new Q&A platform called Slido. So if you're online, there will be a link dropped into the chat, which will allow you to submit your questions. If you're in person, there is a URL behind me, along with an ID for our meeting that you'll need to enter, and then you can submit your questions on Slido. Today's webinar is also going to be recorded, and it's been approved for CLE credit. So if you haven't provided us with your attorney number yet, and you're online, please make sure to email the Murphy Institute. If you are in person, there were sign-up sheets at the door that you'd be able to record your attorney number on those. Today's webinar is going to be offered by Professor Teresa Collett. Professor Collett is the director of the law school's Pro-Life Club. She has published numerous legal articles as well as co-authored a casebook on professional responsibility. And she was a co-editor of a collection of essays exploring Catholic and then capital C Catholic perspectives on American law. She is an elected member of the American Law Institute and has testified before committees of the U.S. Senate as well as the House of Representatives and various state legislatures. In 2019, or I guess not 2019, 2009, Pope Benedict XVI appointed Professor Collett to a 5-year term on the Pontifical Council for the Family. This appointment was renewed for an additional 5 years by Pope Francis. And finally, on a personal note, I had the honor and privilege of having Professor Collett during my first year of law school as my property professor. And something you're not going to find on her resume or in her bio or anywhere public probably is that she is one of the best people I know. She is a gifted public speaker. And I think one thing that stood out to me about my experience with Professor Collett was her ability to engage in hot button issues like what we're going to talk about today, but in a very authentic and caring manner. And her awareness of the person on the other side of the table is profound. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Collett.
Well, that was sort of a charming but discombobulating introduction. So thank you very much. I would like to talk about this as a data issue. The presentation I'm about to give does not address all the arguments that many proponents of legal abortion advance. Rather, it is limited simply to testing a proposition that is presented by the court in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. It is an argument that Helen Alvarez, Erica Bacciacci, and I presented to the Supreme Court in our amicus brief on behalf of 240 women scholars and professionals. And so it is an argument that you can read in full and actually study the data, if you wish, in that amicus brief, which is accessible through the SCOTUS blog. One of the things I like about SCOTUS blog, and there are many things I like about it, is that you can actually see all of the amicus briefs that are listed with a link to the Supreme Court docket instead of trying to search out the docket and know the case number and that sort of thing. It's very easy, accessible. So with no further ado, let me begin with, where is the introduction? So in the area of abortion, 49 years ago, when the court handed down Roe versus Wade, they made some assumptions that they did not necessarily try to establish through any sort of evidentiary record. In Roe, the court held that the right to privacy included a woman's right to obtain abortion based on the conclusory explanation, quote, the detriment that the state would impose upon the pregnant woman by denying this choice of abortion altogether is apparent. Now, I would suggest, especially for law students watching this, that that's the sort of language that when you see it in your opponent's brief, you know they have no proof for it because they haven't bothered to try to prove it. They simply say, well, this is obvious and beyond argument. The court goes on then, approximately 20 years later, 19 to be exact, in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, and the plurality or the controlling opinion in that case that was not comprised of 5 justices, it was 3 justices. The controlling opinion holds that Roe needs to be affirmed because of women's reliance interest in the judicially created right to abortion. But once again, when we look at the language that the plurality uses, we discover they don't provide any citation to the record, any citation to any evidence. Rather, they provide a single citation. This is what the plurality say. For 2 decades of economic and social developments, people have organized intimate relationships and made choices that define their views of themselves and their places in society in reliance on the availability of abortion and in the event that contraception should fail. The ability of women to participate equally in the economic and social life of the nation has been facilitated by their ability to control their reproductive lives through access to abortion. Now notice there's a conflation of contraception and abortion. They don't separate out abortion from contraception. And when you enter into the debate in this area, what you discover is that a lot of the data conflates the two also. But to my knowledge, there are no state legislatures in this country at this time seeking to statutorily reject Griswold versus Connecticut, the case that in fact found a constitutional right for married couples to use to use contraception. Nor to my knowledge is there any state in the union where legislative proposals are pending trying to reverse Eisenstadt, which expanded that right to single individuals. Contraception is seen by the American people as a very different proposition than abortion. The evidence that the plurality gave in support of their, as I characterize it, and as we characterize it in our brief, simplistic historical and empirical assumption was a single citation to a self-described feminist Marxist scholar. This professor, in the book cited by the court, summarizes her conclusions in her introduction thus: abortion in the 1970s and 80s is the consequence, not cause, of complex and mostly positive changes in young women's lives since 1960. In other words, the court's citation to this authority for their proposition that it is the cause of women's ability to more fully participate in society has it exactly backwards. The authority they cite to, in fact, disavows the position that the court relies on in saying that they must continue to adhere to Roe because of stare decisis. An odd and troubling proposition. To test this assumption, Helen Alvarez, Erica Bacciacci, and I gathered and reviewed government data on women's economic status from 1970 to 2016. What we found is that there are innumerable other factors that have contributed to women's social and economic equality, as well as evidence that abortion has actively harmed women and their progress. Let me pause there. It is not our assertion, unlike the Casey plurality, that it is a proven fact that the wide availability of abortion has impeded women's success and advancement. It is our proposition that there is some evidence that would support that conclusion, but we do not and have not reached that conclusion because we simply were not investigating that thesis. That was not the question before us in the court brief that we were trying to prepare. What we found is, though, that there is no consistent correlation between abortion rates and ratios with indicators of women's participation in the economic life of our country. Now, you don't have to be a statistical scholar to understand that if something doesn't correlate with another thing, it can't be the cause. Correlation is some evidence of causation, but not sufficient proof in and of itself. But if you don't have a correlation, if they don't match up, it can't be the cause. So what we found is that there are innumerable other factors that have contributed to women's social and economic equality, as well as evidence, again, that abortion has actively harmed women in their progress. Evidence, not conclusion. One of the factors that we took into account, as Justice Rehnquist did in his dissent in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, is that prior to Roe, the federal government, not to mention state governments as well, but the federal government was actively pursuing equality of men and women in the marketplace. As early as 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed by Congress, and it applied throughout the country. In 1948, Women's Armed Services Integration Act was passed by Congress. A particularly important one in 1963 was the Equal Pay Act that Congress passed. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed. In 1968, the Fair Housing Act. Those of you who take my property class or have taken my property class know that that's a little equivocal in that we don't see many cases where landlords are discriminating against women as opposed to men. Lawyers, yes, we have that case in the casebook, but nonetheless, it is one of the pieces of statutory evidence that there was an active effort on the part of our federal legislators to approach equality between men and women. In 1971, the Public Works and Economic Development Act that required women be treated equally. And then in 1972, the Equal Employment Opportunity Act. Very important legislation, all independent of abortion. So what we did is we gathered this government data to see what the data showed. Is there at least a correlation? And again, correlation doesn't equal causation, but is there at least a correlation that might tend to support the assumption of the plurality? What we find is from 1974 to 1989, rates of abortion per 1,000 women of childbearing age moved from 242 to 346. There was, in fact, a significant rise in the number of abortions in this country, which frankly, looking at the papers of the justices, took some of them by surprise. During that time, there was also a rise in the participation of women in the total civilian workforce from 39.4% to 45.2%. That's significant. It's 14.7%. There was also an increase in the workforce presence of women from 14.6 to 24.3, a 63% increase. Looking at the percentage of men's average income earned by women, there does not exist reliable measures between 74 and 78, so we couldn't test that. But the Bureau of Labor Statistics, beginning in 79, show that from 79 to 89, abortion rate ratios remained steady, 24 per 100 pregnancies, while abortion rates declined, 3%. Yet there was a 12.5% increase in women's earnings as a percentage of men's earnings. Women moved from earning 62.3 cents for every dollar that a man earns to 71.1 cents. Now, as lawyers, or those of us who are viewing this on Zoom that are lawyers, words are our craft, words are our trade. But for many of us, graphic representation is important. So let me show you the graphs and then we'll come back to those slides. Here's a graph of the total abortions per year according to the CDC. Unfortunately, we know that the CDC data is incomplete because certain states simply do not report the data to the CDC. There's another measure, Guttmacher Institute, but Guttmacher Institute was a research institution founded by Planned Parenthood, and so there's reason to suspect its data as being objective. So part of the problem we have in the United States is we simply don't have great data in this area, like you find in some European countries with nationalized medicine, where every medical procedure is part of a national database. Nonetheless, the CDC is the official database, and you can see that from 1970 to 1992, abortion was on the increase at inconsistent rates, but nonetheless on the increase. And then from 1990 to 2016, the last available data to us at the time we were writing the brief, there was a substantial decline, almost half. Okay. During that time, when we graph out women's abortion ratios, the number of women that are enrolled as college students, the number of women in the workforce that I was just talking about, and abortion rates, and the number of women in the workforce with degrees, what we see is that the blue line, the number of women in the workforce with degrees, increases steadily, independent of abortion ratios and rates. Similarly, we see that the number of women in college continues a gradual rise, as does the number of women in the workforce. As far as the poverty rates, what we see is the abortion rates represented by the orange line, the ratios by the orange line, rates by the gray line, and then on the bottom you see women's poverty rate, which is sort of that burnt orange color, and then you see men's poverty rate. Again, the rise and fall of abortion rates and ratios does not track the rising improvement of the poverty rates in this country. So let's go back and talk about some of the other measures that we used. Look, we've talked about the income. Women's progress in each of these areas continued as abortion rates and ratios started a precipitous decline, beginning in 1990 and continuing to the very recent years, which we have data. From 1990 to 2016, abortion rates declined 46%, from 345 to 186, and abortion ratios fell 52%, from 24 to 11.6. This has been reported publicly in the press, regardless of its political orientation. During the same period, however, the percentage of women in the workforce with a college degree or more rose from 24.5 to 41.6%. Almost half the women in the workforce have a college degree at this point. There's a 70% increase. Women also continued to earn an increasing percentage of men's income, rising from 70.9 to 81.9. That's a 15.5% increase. So notwithstanding the declining rates of abortion, women's advancement continued in these economic measures. Women's college enrollment, just as their participation in the workforce with college degrees, their enrollment in college continued to climb during this period of sharply declining abortion rates and ratios from 54.5 to 56.5, a nearly 4% increase. Women's enrollment in law schools grew from 47.4 in 1990 to 52% in 2016. The first year the number of women exceeded the number of men enrolled in ABA accredited law schools. The number of women enrolled in medical schools grew even more dramatically during this period, increasing from 39.2 in 1990 to 49.8 in 2016. Today, enrollment of women exceeds that of men both in law schools and medical schools. What's ironic is just yesterday, the Chronicle of Higher Education sent out its announcement of its particular issue for that day, and the lead article was the missing male student in undergraduate colleges. Women are pursuing higher education far more often than men are, and are far more likely to have college degrees increasingly, which has an economic impact, of course, dependent upon your major. So we have the charts that we've seen, total abortions. We've seen women's education and labor participation does not support it. Abortion ratios, rates, and the poverty rates. Again, no consistent correlation. Can you find individual years where there looks like there's correlation? Absolutely. But the thing about American data is we now have 49 years worth of data, or almost 49, since we don't have up-to-date reporting all of this yet. This sort of analysis would be virtually impossible to run in a country like Ireland, where abortion's only been legal for less than 5 years. You simply don't have the longitudinal data. And therefore, if there's a lag in either, you simply could not control for it. The percentage of earnings, again, the orange line is abortion ratios. We see the gradual decline here. It's not as dramatic because of the size of the graph, but we also see that women's earnings continue to climb even during the extended period of decline from 1990 to 2016. For those of us who are more tabular, the graphs don't help as much. We also duplicated for the court the actual data that we extracted from these government records. Again, all footnoted, all derived from US federal sources, okay? So you see that you've got your ratios, your rates, the percentage of women in the workforce, the percentage of women with degrees in the workforce, earnings, men's poverty rates, and women's poverty rates. We break it down by decade for the court in order so it's more clear to them. And this is the more interesting data, in our opinion, because this is when abortion rates are falling, abortion ratios are falling, and yet we see women's continued advancement in these particular economic indicators. So that's the argument we make in the brief, that the idea that abortion has proven itself necessary as a backup to contraception for women to advance economically simply ignores both the authority the court cites itself, but also ignores the data that's available on this. It ignores the fact that there are a tremendous number of confounding variables. Things like the statutory acts that were passed by Congress that required women's equal employment opportunity, women's equal pay, et cetera. And that's not even to mention the state acts that were passed. During the same time period, a number of states passed women's equal rights amendment or equal rights amendments. And so all of that, the force of the law, is something that had to be taken into account in order to even begin to think about the causal effect. There's simply not any data that supports it. But when I say that, some of you may be thinking, especially if you're particularly interested in this area and active in this area, but what about that recent Turnaway study? This is a study that was done by the Bixby Research Institute. It is a pro-choice institute. They're very clear about it in California. They, in fact, attempted to build some sort of study that would tell us what the absence of abortion would do to women's lives. And so what's interesting about the study, and it was certainly heralded throughout the New York Times, any number of other press outlets, as definitively clear that women who are denied abortions, perhaps because the gestational stage is too far advanced, that those women's lives became worse because of the absence of the abortion. But let's look at what that study was comprised of. It was comprised of, initially, women that were recruited from 30 different abortion clinics. And the plan was to interview them for 5 years so that they could see how their economic life progressed or regressed, what the impact was. At the beginning, they were able to recruit 392 women for up to 3 weeks past the clinic's cutoff, eventually, meaning that some clinics will not perform abortions after 16 weeks. Other clinics will go up to 24 weeks. And we're aware that there are clinics in states where it's lawful that will go beyond that as well, okay? So we're not certain at exactly what stage of pregnancy these women were turned away, but they were turned away because they did not seek access to abortion within the period of time that the clinics provided them. So they began with 292. 61 dropped out before even the initial survey. So now we're down to 231. And 14 more dropped out after that. So now we're down to less than 220. 69 of the remaining 217 got abortions elsewhere. They simply went to another clinic, or they suffered an abortion, a spontaneous abortion or a miscarriage. All right. So that leaves us 148 women, hardly a statistically significant sample, but nonetheless, it leaves us with 148 women who gave birth, although the researchers were not even sure of the numbers and wrote about the turnaways for some unspecified number of women. No such follow-up information is available. No such follow-up information is available. For measuring the women's economic fates, which of course was the purpose of the study, to prove deleterious economic effects of being turned away from having an abortion, the authors attempted to assess women's pre- and post-turnaway situations, but could obtain financial information only for 76.3% of the turnaway women, 3 out of 4. And this means that of the 217 women whom the authors continue to call turnaways, they obtained financial information for about 165 of them. The authors do not specify whether among those 165 were the 32% that had abortions later or had miscarriages. We simply don't know, nor have they submitted their research data to independent researchers for review and critique. They have refused to release it to any other researchers that are not affiliated with the abortion industry. This sort of evidence would not survive any sort of serious cross-examination in a court of law, just as the court's citation in Planned Parenthood versus Casey as support for its claim that abortion is causally linked to women's economic empowerment would not survive cross-examination either. And with that, I open the floor to questions.
So the first question is, if correlation doesn't equal causation, could this decrease in abortion rates and increase in female economic activity be very?
It could be. It could be, which doesn't defeat our point to the court in the Dobbs case, which is that to the extent the Casey rule derived from the plurality is that it must be sustained. This unlimited access to abortion must be sustained because it causes women's advance. The lack of any correlation at all simply makes that statement nonsensical.
The next question is, does any of your data account for the race of women, college enrollment, workforce, poverty, earnings? Are any groups overrepresented?
It's government data, and so it has all races, if that's what you're asking. And I know it's not your question.
Did the data split out the races at all with those numbers?
I believe there was some that got that granular, others did not.
Next is, what do you think caused the decrease in abortion rates after Roe?
Again, that was not the purpose of our study, and there's been all sorts of speculation about that, and I'm really trying to stay with data in this presentation. I think there is an interesting change in the culture. Many people who take the position I do that abortion is not a fundamental or human right, and in fact is something that the state should and can restrict, would say that many younger people in our society are increasingly seeing the humanity of the unborn and therefore not choosing it. There may be more, there's no question that between 73 and today, there have been more effective means of contraception made available through technology. There's no question that opportunities have opened up in lots of other ways. So I'm not prepared to answer that question, although I think it's an important one.
This is similar to the question about breaking out the data by race, but this individual is wondering if data had been broken out by income quintile. Wealthier women get many more abortions.
In fact, that's not a true statement. Wealthier women do not have a higher abortion rate And so, but I know that from other data, not by deep diving into the Department of Labor's data or even the CDC data.
So make a statement. Statutory support of equality. Hyphen. Would you support the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment? How could this amendment impact women's empowerment / abortion?
I actually have filed a brief on behalf of the Pro-Life Center in the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court opposing an interpretation of that state's Equal Rights Amendment that would include abortion and that would include public funding of abortion. In Minnesota, we have public funding of abortion through judicial edict in Doe versus Gomez. I would not support an Equal Rights Amendment to the extent we did not have a state constitutional amendment that took at a minimum the abortion neutrality stand, meaning that many states now have within their state constitutions amendments that say this constitution neither provides for nor prohibits regulation of abortion. They take the judiciary out of it and leave it to the political process.
How would you respond to arguments that the data shows increases in abortion rates post-Roe correlated to decreases in crime 2 decades later?
In fact, that particular statement, I believe, is probably relying on the book Freakonomics, where the author, an academic, makes that argument. And there's both a substantive argument and then there's a research argument. There is a rough correlation, but again, correlation doesn't equal causation. And so I would dispute that he had adequately weighed confounding variables. And the substantive problem with that idea is that abortion should be used in order to eliminate people predictively of their criminality. I believe there was a movie made about that about 20 years ago where you were summarily executed if there was reason to believe because of your genetic background you would turn out to be a criminal. And people are worried about race and poverty as a part of this discussion. That's a really problematic proposition.
Does your abortion data include chemical versus non-surgical abortions? Does it include morning after pills?
Morning after pill is a different dynamic. The CDC does include the medical or chemical abortions when it became a fairly common method for early abortions.
Okay, the next question is, if the justices who were in the majority in Roe and Casey had known the stats you cited, do you think they would have voted the way they did in those cases?
Well, I would recommend, if you're interested in the history of Roe and the political shenanigans, and yes, I will call them political shenanigans engaged in on the Supreme Court, there is a very good book by Clark Forsythe on the history of Roe. And so I think that that data would not, it wouldn't exist, right, in 1973. But even if they'd had an accurate prediction of the data as it turns out to be, I fear it would not have discouraged at least 3 of the 7 justices that voted for Roe. I think they were influenced by things like the American Law Institute, for which I'm an elected member, but nonetheless, the American Law Institute received an award from the Playboy Foundation for its advancement of what they considered sexual liberty. So I don't know that facts would have gotten in the way of the ruling. In Planned Parenthood versus Casey, those of you who know much about the history of that case, in fact, Justice Kennedy announced in committee after hearing oral arguments that he was going to vote to overrule Roe. And then Justice O'Connor approached him and persuaded him that the reputation of the court, and you see that theme running throughout the Kennedy, or throughout the opinion, the plurality opinion, that the court would be perceived as, quote, reversing under fire and giving way to political will. And so I don't know if that would have stopped him. I think it might have, in which case we would have had a 5-4. but I don't know that it would have. That, of course, is an argument being made today. It's an argument that was made by Senator Schumer on the courthouse steps just a few years ago when there was another abortion case before the justices that Justice Gorsuch and Kavanaugh in particular would, quote, reap the whirlwind if they in fact imperil Roe. So that argument is fairly effective with some of the justices. Other of the justices believe that that sort of political pressure being brought to bear by either side is inappropriate as a consideration.
Okay, so there's a follow-up to the race data question. Is there correlation between race and abortion? Example, are more white women with abortions?
Again, that takes us away from the economic empowerment argument, notwithstanding that that's the abortion advocates argument. I just listened to a presentation made by the Center for Reproductive Rights that tries desperately to correlate race and abortion, and taking the position that to prohibit abortion or limit abortion would in some way be racist. The data, it seems, as Justice Thomas argued in his dissent to cert in a fairly recent case, the data is that people of color, women of color, do resort to abortion to deal with unplanned or unwanted pregnancies in a higher percentage than white women do. And to disentangle that from the poverty level, et cetera, is more complex and the subject of a whole nother lecture, which I'm happy to do, but not right this moment.
And I will just ask this because it is here. I think it's a similar response probably, but are you concerned with how low income women might be harmed by a lack of access to abortion? Concerned that wealthier women are driving empowerment stats that we cited?
I am concerned that any woman is not supported in continuing her pregnancy. The New York Times a few years ago did a very interesting expose on pregnancy discrimination and had a variety of women who had in fact been punished by their employers because of the fact that they had chosen to continue their pregnancy and go forward and give birth. While not included in the New York Times expose, that included upper management, marketing, a woman that worked for Walmart, removing trays in the warehouse that were heavy, who asked for a simple accommodation. Her manager said to her, well, I've seen a movie star do backflips when she was 9 months pregnant. What's the problem with you? Which makes me question Walmart's judgment in putting people in supervisory positions, but separate from that, right? You've got that situation. You've got, a publisher of a major news outlet, Bloomberg, who has reported, and it has not been denied, that he told women executives in his company to get rid of the pregnancy. So pregnancy discrimination is real, and it's a problem, notwithstanding that it's illegal. And so am I concerned that all women continuing their pregnancy will continue to be under economic pressure to become a sterile worker, homo economicus? Absolutely. I think we see that happening to men too. You want time off to go coach your kid's soccer team? What are you talking about? You're not really dedicated to your job. But it happens to women more. And so I am concerned, not just poor women. I'm concerned about all women. That was the brilliance, I think, of Governor Casey, Robert Casey, because of course the Pennsylvania law that was at issue in Planned Parenthood versus Casey was passed initially without additional support for families below certain income levels. And he vetoed it and said, send it back to me with more funding for these families and social services. And they did. And of course, the law went into effect, and we see that, it was successful. So do I think there's a balance to be found there? Absolutely. Do I think it can be bought by the lives of these children? No, I don't.
So would you argue that revoking access to abortion would improve women's economic situation or not impact it?
We are, again, as we say in our brief, we are not making the argument because we're in the process of trying to gather it to see if we can make it, to see if the evidence supports it. Logically, it seems to me, given the pregnancy discrimination problem, that it may in fact improve women's situation because the workplace, especially now, given the difficulties in finding workers, et cetera, will be forced to accommodate women's biology instead of just men's biology, childless, sterile, et cetera. And so I think logically that's what we're going to find. But because we want to look at data and we want to look at information that is well-grounded, I'm not prepared to say absolutely. And I think any time that we change the rules in that way, you may have a lag. We're finding in Texas, of course, that there's a time lag. We don't really know the true consequences of the Texas law yet, besides the fact that most abortion providers are no longer providing abortions later in the pregnancy. We do know that, but beyond that, we don't really know beyond that.
So I think there are a few questions coming up here that bring us back to your opening statements about how you're not making a categorical claim that A equals B, but you're just saying there isn't support for the statement found in the opinion.
That is correct.
Okay, so just as a preface, I might be missing where the active harm is coming from. So there are multiple factors leading to women empowerment, but how does abortion hurt?
That's not our proposition. Our proposition is that the court made the affirmative statement. And if we go back, we can see it. The court made the affirmative statement, in fact, that women had this social reliance that was necessary. And they did so referring to a particular scholar who doesn't even make that assumption. For 2 decades of economic and social development, people have organized intimate relationships and made choices that define their views of themselves and their place in society in reliance on the availability of abortion in the event contraception shall fail. I went back and looked at the trial court record, and of course the lawyers that are either watching this on Zoom or here present in the courtroom, the lawyers who are present physically here know that discovery documents are not filed. So I don't have access to all of the trial court data to the extent that it's there. Okay, but it appears that this came whole cloth by the court's decision. There doesn't appear to be an evidentiary basis, and nor do they cite to one. They simply cite to the scholar who herself does not say this. So that's really the task here, is to simply say, don't feel compelled to uphold Casey by stare decisis when Casey itself is premised on a false statement.
So the statistics you provided relate to education, access, and attainment. Have you analyzed or are you aware of data about women in influential careers?
Actually, there was a wonderful brief filed by women legislatures. And I would actually think that depending on how one defines influence, there's perhaps not a more influential career than that of being a teacher. So I'm not sure what they mean by influential. Do they mean high income? Do they mean professional? I'm not sure, but nonetheless, there were a group of women legislators who filed a wonderful brief that shows the data of the increase of women in Congress and at the state level. It was primarily state data that they were concerned with. There's also been a dramatic increase of number of women in the bench. Although I will say that Texas was the first state to have an all-female Supreme Court for a very brief period of time. And it's actually simply because all the men were involved in one of the organizations that was a litigant before the court. So the decision was issued regarding this social group by the women justices. But we see women attaining those sorts of positions of power increasingly. And again, during this precipitous decline in abortion rates from 1990 to 2016.
Okay, so the next one I'm going to ask here is, did you look at any data from other countries? If so, does it support or undermine?
I'm actually doing that actively now. Those of you that are in my United Nations and Catholic Social Thought know that we are in the process of actively engaged in that. Part of the problem is that not all nation states maintain the sort of data that we do. There are actually some countries still in the world that don't even have reliable birth data and death data. So when we're talking about this sort of refined data, you just simply can't find it for those countries. We wanted to look at Ireland. as an example, because it had no legal abortion or very limited legal abortion for an extended period of time, even a period of time under which they had a woman head of state. So, but again, the change in the law has just been too close. You've got the lagging problem. We've only got 4 or 5 years of data, and we don't even have all of that because, again, the health departments aren't getting the data out. But I'm in the process of doing that, and I'm excited about that project.
Okay, so this is going to be an interesting question because they'll ask you to assume the role of the other side.
Yes.
And that may be difficult because you already did make a categorical statement that the lives of the innocent children being lost through abortion, is never worth whatever the outcome is.
I don't think I made it quite that categorical.
Sure.
So,
Okay, well, the question is, what would be a better argument than economic advancement for the right to abortion?
well, certainly we had 3 briefs attempt to respond to our brief on the other side. One were a group of statisticians who never really said we were wrong. They just said, well, there are new ways of interpreting data, and so we can show that. And they relied a little bit on the Turnaway study, but I've already made my argument that the Turnaway study is, if not junk science, we really can't rely on it until they release the data for adverse researchers to look at that data. So I think that's problematic. It reminds me of the way the cigarette industry, maintained control of all the data for years and years and years on cancer. Perhaps the interest that I keep hearing argued by advocates on the other side is that pregnancy is a burden to women, and women, their ability to succeed, their ability to develop their own life script, if you will, has to extend to the right to terminating a pregnancy. And again, if it's just terminating a physical characteristic, I would have a very different position. But I am persuaded that science teaches, among other things, that which is within the woman is a human being, and that it's just not an adequate moral justification to say that a woman can take that child's life, especially post-viability, where she could simply deliver the child, and as Justice Barrett said to one of the advocates, and then simply leave the child under the safe haven laws at the hospital. You don't have to parent in the United States anymore beyond the pregnancy. And so I'm just not persuaded. And it troubles me that we are beginning to say that private acts of violence can be exercised against people who we perceive as being barriers to our advancement.
Has the economic advancement argument used in Rome been successful in other cases?
There's a library full of law books downstairs that contain all sorts of cases. I think that certainly in international tribunals and in certain political debates, that has been a concern. But again, if it's not true, the fact that courts are persuaded to it doesn't really justify continuing to rely on it.
How does expansion of access to birth control play a role?
That's one of the confounding variables that I mentioned, not only expanding access, although actually, if you look at, and I did a paper on contraception, which is why I'm befuddled by this attempt to say that to oppose abortion makes you racist, because actually when you look at the genesis of family planning programs throughout the United States, what you see is during the Nixon administration, of course, this Roe came down in that era, there was an expansion in southern states for family planning, so much earlier than it was in northern states. And there was a federal document saying that we were concerned about the increasing number of these little brown people over in Africa that would cause problems for us. And so we needed to persuade the United Nations, and our foreign policy should be informed by the desire to reduce population. So it's a very odd argument to me. And historically, it doesn't match, but nonetheless, the fact is that we've had changes in technology. We now have long-acting, reversible contraception. We have increasing rates of vasectomies by men as opposed to tubal ligation for women. There are a number of factors that are all confounding as far as proving causation.
Would abortion rates fall if there was access to affordable housing, healthcare, and laws requiring companies to give their employees parental leave?
I don't know. I don't know. I think some of those are very good things. I wish we saw active enforcement of pregnancy discrimination. I was involved in assessing a case where, for example, a student who was in a nurse practitioner program made the mistake, most of us would say, made the responsible decision to tell her instructors that she was going to be pregnant her last semester during her practicum. And they made her take the semester off, notwithstanding additional costs, something that's completely happened to be a Catholic institution, which I found particularly appalling. Yet some of her classmates did not make the choice to tell the administration in advance and were able to complete their degree that semester as they were pregnant through their practicum. So there's a lot of things that we need to change. And we need to provide more support. The largest group of the pro-life movement in this country are not people like me that litigate. It's the men and women who fund and run pregnancy assistance centers. It's the men and women who dedicate their services to homes for pregnant women. We have at least 2 here in the Twin Cities area. Pure volunteer effort, amazing people. People who open their checkbooks, their homes, their hearts to support these women so that they can support their children. We need more.
And we are going to hit time here, so this will be the last question. What kind of economic indicators did you look at for lost opportunity of women who choose to carry out a full term?
There's no data. Part of the problem is we don't have access to, so as I said, the Turnaway study, they had 30 abortion clinics that they had access to those patients. I walk in and say, hey, Planned Parenthood of Minnesota, I would love to interview your abortion patients. I promise to maintain patient confidentiality. I just want to do a data analysis. I confess, I haven't even tried because I don't know that I would even get past the reception desk. There's just a monopoly on the data.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Collett, for joining us today. I'm going to step on screen for our Zoomers.
Just a reminder that if you have not sent in your attorney ID, please email it to the Murphy Institute, or if you're in person, sign up at one of the sign-up stations at the doors. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us today and have a wonderful rest of your day.